Forever am I bound, hope abandoned, my spirit tethered to this place. What destroyed the circle could not touch me, for I was newly dead and beyond harm's reach. I alone was spared the descent into madness, and Kain alone was spared the pain of death. When Nupraptor's poison seized Kain even in the safety of the womb, much more than just his destiny was lost. All of Nosgoth lost balance. Consider us now, both of us less than we once were. I, pure but insubstantial, and Kain, terribly real, but corrupted.
In Legacy of Kain, power manifests in a vast number of ways. From the forbidden allure of dark magic, to the exhilarating promise of dominion over the whole world, all manner of people, sorcerers, and creatures within the realms of Nosgoth are drawn to power, enticed by its seductive appeal, and driven by desire and ambition. Yet as they each grasp at the reins of influence and control, they often find themselves ensnared in a web of lies, temptation, and moral compromise. While plenty of stories and literature focus on how power corrupts those who acquire it, Dennis Dyack and Amy Hennig's Legacy of Kain series shows us how power can be magnetic to those already corrupted. In the beginning of Blood Omen, Ariel, the Balance Guardian, is murdered by Mortanius, while under the malevolent control of a dark entity. She's brutally stabbed, and her mutilated corpse is left for her lover and fellow guardian, Nupraptor, to find. As guardian of the Pillar of Mind, Nupraptor is a magician of phenomenal mental and psychic ability. He's hypersensitive to people's thoughts and feelings, and this prolonged exposure has made him prone to rash decisions and unpredictable behaviour. Upon discovering his lover's body, Nupraptor is devastated and racked with grief. He's immediately overcome with suspicions of treachery. Plunging into a vengeful madness, he turns his powerful magic to bear on the other members of the Circle of Nine. All across Nosgoth, the minds of the sensitive and intellectual were blasted by relentless waves of hatred. Not even Ariel's successor, Kain, was spared from the assault. At the time, the infant Kain was still residing in his mother's womb, as he was infected with Nupraptor's madness like a disease. When the enchantment came to an end, the entire circle was left insane, with some raving like madmen, while others retained malicious control of their actions. From that moment forward, Nosgoth was at their mercy. The pillars, bound as they were to their guardians, were also tainted by the corruption, and began to crack and corrode, rotting to the core, and poisoning the very land itself. This insidious disease, inflicted by Nupraptor, is a major turning point in Nosgoth's history, and the corruption of the pillars is arguably the most influential event within the Legacy of Kain mythos. In these games, corruption isn't just a theme which explores how the abuse of power leads to personal gain. It's a malevolent force that infects the sanctity of our protagonist's soul and holds the entire world hostage. As Kain explains,
"This is the sublime moment of our undoing, Raziel. The ineffable fulcrum upon which swings the entirety of our history. This is where all of Nosgoth is betrayed."
For the next 30 years, the circle degenerated further into insanity. The Pillar Guardians eventually found themselves consumed by greed, hubris, and the relentless pursuit for greater power. As they succumbed to their darker impulses, these sorcerers ultimately lost not only their humanity, but their very souls, becoming twisted reflections of their former selves. For example, Bane, the Nature Guardian, was born to serve and protect the elements. Through his magic he could manipulate the weather, animate plants, and influence animals, all for the betterment of Nosgoth's various biomes. But following his descent into madness, Bane turned his back on everything he once stood for. Together with his fellow guardians Dejul the Energist and Anakroth the Alchemist, he fashioned a garden of horrors. They created a warped land named Dark Eden, which became infested with strange creatures, things half insect and half mammal, human torsos grafted onto abominations of the flesh. It was a sick perversion of nature's design. If Bane prior to his corruption could see into the future, I'm sure he would have been disgusted by the man he'd one day become. While certain members of the Circle may have had good intentions at one point, it's important to understand that they were never paragons of virtue. Besides Ariel, most of the other Guardians were deeply flawed human beings, and some were twisted and depraved long before Nupraptor's madness took hold. Azimuth, for one, had sadistic tendencies. As an explorer of alien realms, her magic opened portals and doorways to other dimensions, allowing creatures to slip into Nosgoth and cause chaos. On the developer Silicon Knights webpage, it said Azimuth revels in the destruction she has wrought with sadistic glee, a trait that was present even before she was driven insane by Nupraptor's magic. This tells us that she was always a cruel and vindictive woman, and that her perverted nature had been enhanced by the corruption. By the time Kain confronts her, she is nothing but a raving lunatic that revels in the pain and misfortune of others. It's interesting to speculate just how the corruption influenced the Circle, because it seems like they were all affected differently. For instance, consider the oldest members, Mortanius and Mobius. Given that Mortanius was already possessed by the Hilden from the demon dimension, the corruption may not have impacted him as much as the others. In fact, it seems he was the only one to resist the poison and tried his utmost to atone for his sins and return the pillars to vampire guardianship. Mobius, on the other hand, carried a profound hatred for the vampire race as a result of his unwavering worship and loyalty to the Elder God. For centuries, he was completely on board with wiping out the vampires. Although it's possible that as the Time Guardian, the madness might have retroactively affected Mobius eons before the moment Nupraptor discovered Ariel's corpse. Although this is just a theory, it would be an interesting twist and may explain why Mobius was easily swayed by the Elder God and was so driven to commit genocide of an entire race. In any event, I think a strong argument could be made that the corruption didn't necessarily alter the Guardians' personalities, but amplified whatever negative traits they had before Nupraptor lost his mind. However, our protagonist Kain is a special case. What's fascinating about Kain's corruption is that he was born into the madness. It's something that he's been forced to live with from the outset. It's been present for almost his whole existence. Before becoming a vampire, Kain had been raised in the town of Korhagen, the finest city in the realm, rich in vanity and conceit. As the son of a nobleman, Kain quickly became arrogant, and I believe his pride was augmented by the corruption festering within him. It dominated his personality, and by the end of the first game, it's safe to say that he's a classic megalomaniac and sadist. In Blood Omen 1, Kain became the scourge of the Circle, killing the inflicted guardians to restore their pillars. Every guardian had a token which binds them to their pillar. For a corrupted pillar to be purified, the associated guardian had to be killed, and their token returned to be absorbed into the column.
The scales of Anacroth I lay before the Pillar of States. The pillar accepted its offering. Thus it was restored.
The Balance Guardian was different from the others, as they didn't have a physical artifact as their token. Their soul bound them to their pillar. This explains why a new Balance Guardian wasn't born to succeed Kain when he was assassinated. His soul had to be returned to the Pillar of Balance, but it was prevented by Mortanius, who had kept it in the underworld in order to raise Kain as a fledgling vampire. Essentially, this means that Kain was the last Guardian to be born. As soon as the Balance Pillar became corrupted, the Pillars were no longer able to choose new Guardians. For the cycle to begin anew, they all had to die. Despite slaying most of the other members, Kain refused to sacrifice himself to end the corruption. Instead, he chose to take Vorador's words to heart, transcending mortality and embracing godhood. He's a pathological egotist who is obsessed with power. If not for the madness which plagued him, it's possible that Kain would have gone about things differently. He might not have been so ruthless in his quest to cleanse the circle. Indeed, Nupraptor's poison appears to be the reason why he used such brutal methods to achieve his goals. There's also the implication that Kain may have even accepted the sacrifice had he not been overcome with such an intense desire to rule the world and rebuild Nosgoth in his own image. This reinforces the idea that power attracts pathological personalities. Kain's climb to power exposed cognitive and behavioural predispositions that existed inside him. His ascent revealed his innate narcissism, aggressiveness, and authoritarian nature.
Raziel, the failed assassin. You had Kain at your mercy, but lacked the courage to fulfill the act. And now you see the wasteland wrought by the tyrant's hand, by his selfish decision to preserve his own life, even when it meant sacrificing the whole world. This is the fate of Nosgoth, as long as Kain remains alive.
In Soul Reaver, we see the repercussions of Kain's selfish decision. Even as he built his great empire, he remained oblivious to how deeply the taint ran. Nearly 500 years after Nupraptor first unleashed his spell, Kain raided the tomb of the Saravanan, resurrecting 6 members of the Order to become his vampire lieutenants. Breathing a part of his soul into them, Kain raised the Saravanan commanders from the dead, but by doing so passed his corruption on. His progeny, in turn, split off part of their newly fused souls to create the clans. In this way, every vampire descended from Kain contained not only a sliver of his original soul, but a fragment of Nupraptor's madness as well. By the time Kain's empire reached its peak, thousands of years after the Mentalist's death, every single vampire in Nosgoth was corrupted. The poison affected the vampires quite differently than it had the human members of the Circle. Over an enormous length of time, the vampires' bodies began to change. These occurred in gradual stages, marked by the vampires periodically retreating into quiescent states from which they emerged with new mutations. At first, the changes were beneficial, bestowing gifts, making them stronger, more resilient, and as they believed, more divine. They became similar to the ancient vampires of long ago. But eventually, Kain's progeny started to experience the most extreme transformations. The vampire race began to degenerate rapidly, transforming into hideous, deformed monstrosities. The Mokaim rotted alive, whilst incorporating the flesh of corpses into their own. The Zephonim developed insect-like qualities. The Rahabim became aquatic. The Dumahim grew armoured carapaces. And the Turalim gained bat-like features, in addition to a heightened sense of hearing. The devolution didn't just affect the clans physically either. There's evidence to suggest that the corruption was slowly eating away at their sanity. This is best conveyed through the clan leaders themselves. During the Soul Reaver era, Malchiah is depressed and wanting to die. Zephon is twisted and bestial. Rahab is fanatically fixated on Kain. Duma is consumed by delusions of grandeur, and Terrell is deranged. Only Raziel and Kain seem to have been spared from the effects of vampiric devolution. For Raziel, his execution appears to have halted his decay. By the start of Soul Reaver 1, he's technically no longer a vampire anymore, as the scorching of his body in the abyss has left him a wraith.
You have missed so many changes, little Raziel. Look around you. See how the human's weapon of destruction has become my home. Indeed, my body. A cocoon of brick and granite from which to watch a pupating world.
As for Kain, there's a theory that he simply used Mobius's time-streaming device to travel forward in time to the point when Raziel returned to the material realm. Thus, Kain was able to avoid many of the undesirable changes he would have experienced had he waited out the centuries for Raziel's return. Power often comes at a steep price, one that is paid in blood, betrayal, and the shattering of great kingdoms. Kain achieved the pinnacle of success. He rose to absolute power, emerging as a god emperor. But for all his efforts, he's eventually forced to confront the fact that his empire would one day succumb to decadence and decay. At some point, Kain finally started to look inward, confronting the dark depths of his soul and leaning more into his role as Sign of Balance instead of tyrannical monarch. In both movies and literature, we see how characters who have fallen from grace can find themselves on a journey of self-discovery and remorse, seeking to atone for their past actions and reclaim their former nobility. Legacy of Kain shows us that even the most corruptible of protagonists can seek redemption. It probably wasn't any one thing that motivated Kain to change from megalomaniac to thoughtful pragmatist. I suspect it was a culmination of over 1,000 years of maturing, as well as extensive study of the chronoplast's past and future visions, which helped him grow in both knowledge and wisdom. In the end, Nupraptor's corruption posed an existential threat to the protagonists and the world they inhabited. Kain and Raziel's story wasn't just about finding a way to restore the pillars, it was also about removing the corruption that plagued Kain's entire existence. In the ever-changing landscape of fantasy, power and corruption are timeless themes, and I appreciate how these games portray corruption as a real force for evil. I think the way Legacy of Kain handles corruption goes a long way to illuminate the complexities of morality, free will, and the consequences of insanity. You know, I'd love to go into further detail about the Wraithblade's role in purifying Kain, but I feel like there's a lot of information to unpack there, so I think I'll save that for a future video. Stay tuned if you're interested in seeing a breakdown covering that topic. Please leave a like if this content was enjoyable to you, and for more Legacy of Kain deep dives, do subscribe. Thanks for dropping by.